Odysseus and Penelope. 20 years of faithful love in the long shadow of war and the restless pull of the sea. Two hearts remain tied to one another across distance, rumor, and time. This narration follows Odysseus and Penelope not only as figures of legend, but as husband and wife whose love is tested by absence, duty, pride, grief, and enduring hope. Before the storms, before the shipwrecks, before the halls of Ithaca grow heavy with waiting, there is a quieter world to enter first. A world of stone hearths, olive groves, familiar shorelines, and the small rhythms of married life that give meaning to everything that will later be lost. Ithaca is not the richest kingdom in the Greek world, nor the most splendid. It does not dazzle like the great cities built for display, and it does not rest upon broad plains overflowing with abundance. It is rougher than that, more intimate, more difficult, and perhaps for that very reason more beloved. It is an island shaped by rock, wind, and sea, a place where life asks something of everyone who lives there. The hills rise sharply, the harbors are few and precious, and the earth rewards patience more than pride. Men know the labor of the oar and the field alike. Women keep households, not as ornaments of comfort, but as the center of continuity and survival. In Ithaca, kingship is not merely ceremony, it is duty made visible every day. To rule such a place means understanding the value of stores laid by for winter, of loyal servants, of strong timber, of peace among households, of judgment that must be fair, because everyone's life touches everyone else's. Ithaca teaches closeness. It teaches memory. It teaches that home is not an abstraction, but 1,000 repeated acts of care. This is the world that shapes Odysseus, long before he becomes a wanderer in story. He is a man of Ithaca known and rooted. He is introduced to us not as a conqueror, but as a man defined by a tension inside him, clever and searching, restless in mind, yet deeply attached to the thought of home. His intelligence moves quickly. He sees angles that others miss, and understands that strength alone does not win every contest. He is alert, practical, and hard to deceive. Yet these qualities do not make him cold. If anything, they make his attachment to home stronger, because he understands how fragile security really is. Odysseus belongs to the sea, but not simply as a man who longs to roam. The sea promises movement, danger, and renown. It stirs the imagination and calls to ambition. Yet what makes Odysseus who he is, even in the earliest understanding of him, is that he is drawn just as strongly in the opposite direction. He is attached to hearth, bed, lineage, and name. He wants to be remembered, yes, but he also wants to return. That desire to come back is not an afterthought in his character. It is one of the deepest truths about him. Beside him stands Penelope, and too often she is mistaken for stillness alone, as though waiting were the whole of her nature. But Penelope is not merely patient. She is perceptive from the beginning, self-possessed, watchful, and inwardly strong. If Odysseus is quick of mind and motion, Penelope is quick of mind and silence. She understands people. She sees what is said and what is withheld. There is dignity in her, but not distance. There is feeling in her, but not disorder. She does not need loudness to possess authority. Her steadiness is not emptiness. It is discipline, intelligence, and emotional endurance, already present long before hardship demands it. Penelope's strength is domestic in the deepest sense of the word, not because it is small, but because it protects the place where human life becomes meaningful. She knows how fragile peace can be, how much rests on a woman's ability to hold a center when the world outside is uncertain. She is not passive clay shaped by events. She is a consciousness equal to them, a woman whose inner life gives force to all that follows. Their marriage begins then, not as a decorative prelude to legend, but as the true heart of it. Royal marriage carries responsibility. It joins families, stabilizes inheritance, and secures the future of a kingdom. Yet for Odysseus and Penelope, it also becomes a partnership shaped by recognition. Each finds in the other something necessary. Odysseus, for all his agility, finds steadiness. Penelope, for all her composure, finds vitality and warmth. Their bond is not from fantasy but from mutual worth, and from the ordinary days that make up a marriage, mornings of shared plans, evenings by the fire, conversations interrupted by tasks, and resumed, without effort, courtyards, the order of meals, harvests and festivals, the quiet relief of sleeping under one roof. This is not trivial happiness. It is the fabric from which love draws its deepest strength. For a king and queen, domestic happiness is never separate from duty. Their household is both intimate and public, and a well-ordered home reflects a well-ordered realm. Then Telemachus is born, and the world grows fuller. A child changes the meaning of time. Before, husband and wife belonged to one another only in the present. Now they belong to the future as well. In Telemachus, lineage becomes flesh. The kingdom has an heir, but beyond that formal fact, the family becomes something even more vulnerable and precious. Odysseus looks at his son with a tenderness sharpened by responsibility. He is no longer only a husband and ruler, but a father, and fatherhood binds him more tightly to Ithaca, even as the wider world will soon demand his presence elsewhere. Penelope, too, is transformed. Her role deepens. She becomes not just the center of the household, but the guardian of a child's earliest world. This is the cruel beauty at the beginning of their story. Just as life becomes most whole, it also becomes most vulnerable. Beyond Ithaca, history is gathering force. The Greek world is bound by oaths, rivalries, and obligation. And when Helen is taken to Troy, the matter does not remain a private grievance. It becomes a call that reaches kings across the sea, summoning them into a conflict larger than any one household. Men who once pledged themselves to defend a marriage are now required to prove that pledge through war. No ruler can easily ignore the demand. To refuse is to risk shame, dishonor, and a fracture in the network of loyalties that holds the age together. Odysseus understands the burden of this call, perhaps more clearly than most. He is intelligent enough to see what lies beneath heroic language. War promises glory, but it also devours years. It turns men into absences. In several tellings, he tries at first to avoid the summons, as if some part of him already senses the scale of the disaster hidden inside the command to go. But heroic cultures are not gentle toward reluctance. Duty presses inward. Reputation matters. Odysseus may love his home, but he also belongs to a world in which honor is public and obligation has teeth. He cannot remain only a husband in private life when history calls him into a collective cause. Love does not cancel duty, and duty does not soften itself for love. For Penelope, the burden is of a different kind, but no less profound. She does not march to Troy. She cannot win renown with spear or stratagem. Yet she must absorb the consequences of decisions made in a world governed largely by male ambition and oath. Her husband's departure is not a clean wound. It is an opening into years she cannot yet imagine, with no map, no promise of return, no reliable measure of hope. When he prepared to leave, Odysseus did not leave behind an idea of home. He left a woman whose face he knew in lamplight, whose voice he could recognize from another room, whose judgment he trusted. He left an infant son, whose life had scarcely begun. The pain of his departure lies not in abstraction but in these details. The call to gather ships and men belongs to a public world, and public worlds move quickly. Plans had to be made, provisions counted, loyal men summoned from farms and workshops, commands issued in daylight even while grief was still trying to find its voice in private rooms. And Penelope, newly a mother, had little luxury for collapse. A household still had to run. Food had to be managed, stores accounted for, workers directed, appearances maintained. She was queen, and queenship in a small island kingdom was not ornament but attention, steadiness, and endurance. Even before Odysseus left, the shape of her waiting had already begun. There is an image that quietly wounds more than any battlefield. Odysseus holding Telemachus for what may be the last time before he sails. The child is too young to know that the arms holding him are about to vanish from his daily world. He knows only warmth, voice, and the nearness of those who care for him. Telemachus will grow not on recollection but on stories. He will know his father first as a name, then as an absence, then as a standard by which others measure him. At the shore, departure becomes undeniable. There is a moment before a ship leaves when all possibility still seems suspended, and then the ropes are handled, the orders called, and motion begins. What was thinkable becomes actual. Penelope does not watch a legend sailing out. She watches her husband become unreachable. The noise of preparation giving way to the terrible simplicity of less and less voice, less detail, less certainty, until the horizon swallows what love can still see. So the household of Ithaca, barely formed, is pulled apart by the demands of history, and Penelope is left standing at the edge of a loss she cannot yet measure. The war that follows will test warriors, yes, but it will also test the invisible bonds that hold a human life together. And that is why the beginning matters so much. Because Ithaca is loved, because Penelope is fully alive, because Odysseus is divided between the world's demands and the home that gives his striving meaning. The happiness at stake in this story is specific, ordinary, and irreplaceable. For those who fought it, the war at Troy was noise, blood, and glory spoken of in the language of kings. For Penelope, it became something else entirely. The long discipline of enduring what she could not change and preserving what she could not bear to lose. In the first years, the absence may still have felt almost bearable. Men of rank went to war, wives kept the hearth, and kingdoms leaned on routine until the soldiers came home. There would have been seasons when each sail glimpsed on the horizon stirred hope, and every rumor carried inland by traders or passing sailors seemed as though it might finally carry his name. But wars expected to end quickly have a cruel way of stretching into whole eras. A campaign becomes a siege becomes a generation's undertaking. What was once an interruption hardens into a way of life. At Troy, the years consumed men in ways no victory could ever repay. The brightest strength of 1,000 households was poured into dust, heat, and iron. Oaths, made in the confidence of early manhood, had to survive hunger, boredom, wounds, pride, and the grinding saneness of a war that refused to resolve itself. 10 years is a terrible price for any city, and a terrible price for any home. Glory could not restore the birthdays missed, the fathers buried in absence, the infants left as babies who were now nearly old enough to ask hard questions. Odysseus, with all his brilliance, was not merely spending 10 years winning a war. He was spending 10 years away from the one place where he was husband, father, and king, not in title alone, but in daily truth. In Ithaca, Penelope was spending those same years in a different currency. Waiting, uncertainty, the steady offering up of private comfort so that public order might endure. It is one thing to miss someone for a month, the heart still warm with certainty. It is another to live inside a silence so prolonged that memory itself begins to feel fragile. A face remembered less clearly, a voice recalled only approximately. Faithfulness under such conditions is not a mood, it is work. As queen, she could not surrender to grief the way an ordinary woman might. Supplies had to be managed, alliances observed, servants directed and protected, and Ithaca, rough-edged and proud, had to feel that the royal house still possessed order and restraint. Year by year, Penelope learned how to inhabit authority without hardening into coldness, how to carry loneliness without letting it distort her judgment. She folded sorrow inward and turned outward toward responsibility, speaking calmly when she wanted to weep, making decisions while longing for counsel. Others spoke of Troy in terms of honor, of kings proving themselves, of vengeance and reputation, the language of the public world, which gives suffering a shape that can be admired from a distance. Penelope measured the years differently. In harvests gathered without him, in winters endured without his step at dusk, in garments prepared for a growing son whose father was not there to see whether they fit. She counted the changing lines of Telemachus's face, the deepening of his voice, the first signs of his father's bearing appearing in a body shaped largely by absence. At first it was enough to tell her son that his father was a brave king fighting a necessary war. But as the years accumulated, even explanation became painful. Faithfulness took on the daily form of motherhood. She had to preserve Odysseus not only in her own heart, but in the imagination of his son, giving Telemachus an inheritance of character rather than merely a name. The nights were harder than the days. When duties were finished and speech no longer necessary, the unanswered questions pressed closer. Was he wounded? Was he cold? Did he think of home as vividly as she thought of him? No messenger could relieve that burden, because news of a war is never the same as the presence of the person you love. Scattered reports might confirm that the fighting still raged, a battle won or a hero fallen. But such tidings could not tell her what she most needed to know. To hear that the Greeks pressed on said nothing of whether Odysseus laughed, despaired, or slept. It did nothing to shorten the empty place at her table. Penelope's loyalty did not survive because it was easy, or because she was insulated from pressure and fatigue. It survived because she kept making, day after day, small inward acts of consent, saying yes again to the man who was not there, yes to the life they had begun, yes to the possibility that meaning still existed inside delay. She was not simply frozen in place like an untouched relic. She was living, changing, aging, her youthful beauty settling into something deeper, the beauty of steadiness, of intelligence sharpened by trial, of a love that grew truer rather than merely more theatrical in suffering. Meanwhile, Odysseus was moving through the brutal education of war, tested against the realities of command, alliance, and violence. If Penelope was learning constancy at home, he was learning survival abroad. Their love, though separated by sea and circumstance, was being subjected to parallel disciplines. By the time Troy finally fell, those who had survived were no longer the men who first set sail. Their bodies bore the marks of cost. Their inner lives bore even more. And those waiting for them at home had changed as well, which meant that the reunion so long imagined could never simply restore the old life exactly as it had been. The war would end, yes. But ending is not the same as healing, and return is not the same as arrival into peace. For a brief shining moment, Greece must have felt as though it could breathe again. Troy, the distant city that had consumed the strength of kings, the youth of soldiers, and the patience of waiting households, had finally fallen. Across the islands and the mainland, people lifted their eyes toward the sea with a new kind of hope. One can almost imagine the first rumors racing faster than the ships themselves. Troy is gone, the Greeks have won, the commanders are returning. In halls that had grown used to restraint, lamps burned later that night. Children old enough to understand turned the news into simple certainty. If the war is over, then father is coming home. It is the most natural conclusion in the world. And for many, at first it did happen exactly that way. Ships touched familiar shores. Men stepped again onto the soil of their own kingdoms, scarred and altered but returned. Names that had lived only in prayer and rumor became flesh again. But in Ithaca, certainty did not arrive with the same tide. Odysseus did not come home with the others. At first the absence did not seem like disaster. The sea was wide. The returning fleet had scattered, storms were common. Delays were not unheard of. It would have been reasonable to tell oneself that a little more patience was needed. But waiting changes when the war that once explained it is no longer there to explain it. Before Troy fell, Odysseus's absence had a shape. He was away because all Greece was at war. However painful, that reality gave order to suffering. After the fall of Troy, that structure collapsed. If the war was over and other men were coming home, then what did it mean that Odysseus was still gone? That question is more merciless than grief with a body. Mourning has rituals and witnesses. It has a hard, cold finality that wounds but does not shift beneath the feet. Living inside uncertainty is another thing entirely, rising each morning not knowing whether to hope or despair. The truth, as later report and legend would tell it, was this. The gods themselves had not finished with the man who had helped bring Troy down. His wit had won the war, the plan of the wooden horse was his, but that same cleverness, and the pride that came with it, drew the anger of powers he could not out-argue. What should have been the shortest part of his story, the sail home across a known sea, became instead the longest and strangest ordeal of his life. Where other captains found their harbors within weeks, Odysseus would spend 10 more years finding his, a decade of wandering to match the decade of war, so that the 20 years asked of Penelope's faithfulness would, in the end, be paid to the very last day. What follows is the part of the story that the songs remember most vividly, though it is worth holding on to why it matters here. Every island, every monster, every delay is also a test of the same fidelity we have been describing, a test of whether a man's memory of one small kingdom and one particular woman can survive against the constant invitation of the world to become someone else. The trouble began almost as soon as the ships left the ashes of Troy behind. Odysseus and his 12 vessels put in first among the Cyclones, allies of the fallen city, and in the old habit of war his men sacked their town. It was a small, ordinary cruelty of the kind that ended 100 campaigns, and Odysseus urged his crews to take what they needed and go. They lingered instead, feasting on captured wine and captured pride, and the Cyclones had time to call on their neighbors inland. The counterattack came at dawn, fierce and well organized, and Odysseus lost several men from every ship before the survivors could fight their way back to the water. It was a small defeat, but it set the tone for everything that followed. A warning, easy to miss, that the world beyond Troy would not simply open its arms to the victors. Discipline had won a war. It would take more than discipline to win a way home. A storm sent by Zeus then caught the fleet as it tried to round the Cape of Malea, the southern tip of the Peloponnese, and for 9 days it drove the ships far off the known sea roads, past every familiar coastline, into waters no chart described. When the wind finally dropped, they made landfall among a gentle, drowsy people who lived on the flower of the lotus. The lotus eaters offered no violence at all. That was the danger. They welcomed the scouting party Odysseus sent ashore with open hospitality, and gave them the honeyed fruit of the plant that grew there. Whoever tasted it lost, quietly and without alarm. All wished to report home or continue the voyage. The men who ate simply wanted to stay, to sit among the flowers and forget. When his scouts did not return, Odysseus went after them himself and found them content, weeping only when he tried to lead them back to the ships, longing only for more of the sweet forgetting. He had them dragged bodily to the benches and bound beneath the rowing seats until the craving passed, and he gave the order that no one else was to touch the shore. It was the first lesson of the voyage, and one of the truest, that not every danger looks like a monster. Some of the deepest threats come wearing the face of comfort, offering not pain but the far quieter promise of never having to want anything again, including home. From there, the ships crossed to the land of the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants who lived apart from one another, with no laws, no assemblies, and no care for strangers, trusting instead in the immortal gods to keep their fields fruitful without any need for planting. Odysseus, curious as always and hoping for gifts of hospitality, took one ship's crew ashore and found a vast cave stocked with cheeses, pens of lambs and kids, and the general wealth of a shepherd who lived alone. His men urged him to take what they could carry and leave before the owner returned. Odysseus refused. He wanted to see what manner of host this land might offer, and perhaps, too, he wanted to test himself against whatever waited. It was a decision he would spend the rest of the story paying for. The owner of the cave was Polyphemus, son of the sea god Poseidon, a cyclops of monstrous size, who returned at evening driving his flocks before him, and sealed the cave's mouth with a stone so enormous that no 20 men together could have moved it. When he discovered the strangers inside, he asked, in the rough manner of his kind, who they were and what they wanted. Odysseus answered carefully, invoking the sacred custom that a guest should be fed and sheltered, and asking for the gifts a stranger was owed. Polyphemus answered instead by seizing 2 of the men, dashing them against the cave floor, and eating them raw for his supper, washing the meal down with unmixed milk, indifferent to every law of hospitality that governed the civilized world Odysseus came from. He then lay down among his flocks and slept, while the surviving Greeks, trapped behind a stone none of them could move, could do nothing but grieve in silence. In the morning, Polyphemus ate 2 more men for his breakfast, then drove his flocks out to pasture and sealed the cave again behind him, as easily as a man might close the lid of a quiver. Through that long day, Odysseus turned over every plan he could imagine, and settled on one that depended on patience as much as cunning. He found a great trunk of green olive wood in the cave, size of a ship's mast, cut a length from it, sharpened one end to a point, and hardened it in the fire until it was ready. When the Cyclops came home that evening, and again fed on 2 of his men, Odysseus offered him a skin of strong, unwatered wine he had carried from the ship. A gift, he said, in hope of some kindness in return. Polyphemus drank it, asked for more, drank again, and asked Odysseus his name. Nobody, Odysseus told him. My name is Nobody, and the giant, delighted by what he took for a joke, promised that nobody would be eaten last, as a special favor, and then fell into a drunken sleep. That was the moment Odysseus had been waiting for. He and 4 of his strongest men heated the sharpened stake in the embers until it glowed, then drove it into the single eye of the sleeping giant and turned it, the way a shipwright turns a drill through a ship's timber, twisting the shaft between their palms while the wood hissed and smoked. Polyphemus woke roaring in agony and tore the stake free, and his cries brought the other Cyclopes from their neighboring caves to ask what was wrong. Nobody is killing me by treachery, Polyphemus shouted through the stone door. Nobody is harming me, and his neighbors, hearing this, naturally concluded that if nobody was harming him, then he must simply be in pain sent by the gods, a thing no one else could help with, and they went back to their own firesides. Odysseus's small, absurd trick of a name had done more than any sword could have. Blind and furious, Polyphemus rolled the great stone from the cave's mouth the next morning, and sat in the opening, arms spread wide, feeling for the men he knew would try to slip past among his sheep. Odysseus, refusing to abandon a single companion to that death, tied his remaining men in 3s beneath the bellies of the giant's own rams, using willow branches from the litter of the cave, and lashed himself beneath the largest ram of the flock, clinging to its long fleece. Polyphemus, running his hands along the backs of each animal as it passed, but never thinking to check underneath, let flock after flock go by, murmuring in grief to his favorite ram, wondering why it walked last and slow, as though it grieved for its blinded master, never guessing that the ram carried the very man who had blinded him. Once outside, Odysseus freed his men, drove Polyphemus's own sheep down to the ships, and put out to sea. It was here that his own pride nearly undid the escape it had won. As the ships pulled away, Odysseus could not resist calling back across the water to boast of what he had done, though his crew begged him to stay silent. Polyphemus, hearing a real voice at last, tore the peak from a mountain and hurled it toward the sound, so close that the wave it raised nearly drove the ship back onto the rocks. Still, Odysseus would not be quiet. When his men rowed clear again, he shouted his true name across the water. Odysseus, son of Laert, sacker of cities, of Ithaca, a name he wanted remembered, a glory he could not bear to leave unclaimed. It was the single most human and most costly mistake of the whole voyage. Polyphemus, now able to put a name and a home to his enemy, lifted his hands to his father Poseidon, lord of the sea, and prayed that Odysseus might never reach Ithaca at all, or if fate decreed that he must, that he arrive late, having lost every companion in a stranger's ship to find trouble waiting in his own house. The sea god heard him. From that moment, the god who ruled the very water Odysseus needed to cross became the force working hardest against his return. And the 10 years of wandering that followed can be read, in large part, as the slow, grinding answer to a blinded giant's curse and to one boastful word Odysseus could have chosen not to say. The next island belonged to Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who lived with his family on a floating isle ringed by a wall of unbreakable bronze. He welcomed Odysseus generously, listened for a month to the whole story of Troy, and when the time came to leave, gave him a gift meant to guarantee the very thing Odysseus wanted most, a leather bag in which every contrary wind in the world had been bound and knotted shut, leaving only the one gentle west wind free to blow the ships steadily home. For 9 days it worked exactly as promised. Ithaca itself came into view, close enough that the crews could see men tending fires on the shore, and Odysseus, exhausted from 9 days at the steering oar and trusting his men at last, allowed himself to sleep. That single act of trust cost him everything. His crew, watching him rest, began to whisper among themselves about the bag of Aeolus, certain that it must be full of silver and gold, given secretly to their captain, while the rest of them received nothing for 10 years of war. Their curiosity and their resentment overcame their discipline. They opened the bag to see what treasure it held, and every wind that had been bound inside tore free at once. A howling confusion of gales that swept the ships backward across all the distance they had gained and flung them, days later, back onto the shore of Aeolus's own island. Ithaca lost again just as it had come into sight. Aeolus, hearing what had happened, refused to help a second time. A man so hated by the gods that he could lose a fair wind through his own crew's foolishness was not a man the keeper of storms wished to shelter again, and he sent Odysseus away without another gift. It was a bitter lesson in how thin the line could be between arriving and being thrown back to the beginning, and in how a captain's fortune depends on trust he cannot always control. Rowing now, without wind, the fleet came after several days to the harbour of the Laestrygonians, a country of giants larger and crueler even than the Cyclopes. The natural harbour there was so enclosed by cliffs that 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships sailed straight in and tied up close together inside it, trusting the calm water. Only Odysseus himself, wary after Polyphemus, moored his own ship outside the harbour's mouth, tied to a rock, ready to flee. It was that single act of caution that saved him. When his scouts went ashore to learn what people lived there, they were seized and eaten before they could return, and the Laestrygonian king raised the alarm. Giants swarmed the cliffs above the crowded harbour and hurled boulders down onto the trapped ships, smashing hulls and spearing swimming men like fish for their tables, while the fleet, packed too closely together to maneuver, could not escape. 11 ships and every man aboard them were destroyed in that single ambush. Only Odysseus's own ship, moored apart, was able to cut its cable and row for open water. It was the single greatest loss of the entire voyage, more men gone in one afternoon than in almost everything that followed combined, and it left Odysseus with one ship, one crew, and a first, unbearable taste of what it would mean to carry the deaths of nearly all his companions home to the wives and mothers of Ithaca, who would ask for husbands and sons who were never coming back. With that single remaining ship, grieving and reduced, they came to the wooded island of Aiaia, where the enchantress Circe lived in a stone house at the center of a clearing, surrounded, strangely, by wolves and lions that did not attack, but moved among the visitors with the gentleness of tame dogs. Men, it would later be understood, whom her drugs had already transformed and calmed rather than killed. Odysseus divided his surviving crew in two and sent half, under his lieutenant Eurylochus, to explore the island. They found Circe singing at her loom, and when they called to her, she welcomed them with every appearance of generous hospitality, inviting them in to feast on wine and cheese and barley mixed with her own secret herbs. Eurylochus alone suspected a trap and stayed outside. The rest accepted her welcome. And the moment they had eaten, Circe struck each of them with her wand and turned them into swine, keeping their minds intact inside their new animal bodies, so that they understood exactly what had happened to them, and could only weep and grunt, penned like livestock in her yard. Eurylochus ran back to the ship in terror to report what he had seen, and Odysseus, refusing again to leave any of his men behind, armed himself and went alone to Circe's house to free them. On the way, the god Hermes met him on the path and, out of pity, gave him a plant called moly, black at the root, white as milk in flower, a plant no mortal could safely dig from the earth without divine help, and told him exactly how to use it to resist the witch's power. Odysseus ate the herb before he entered the house, so that when Circe offered him her drugged wine and struck him with her wand, expecting him to fall to his knees as a pig like the others, nothing happened. Startled, and then afraid, Circe recognized in him the one man the gods had foretold would someday resist her, and rather than fight him she surrendered, agreeing under oath to restore his men and do him no further harm, so long as he would share her bed and her table. Odysseus made her swear a solemn oath first, wary even now of one more trap, and only then accepted her hospitality. She restored his transformed men to their own shapes, younger and more handsome, the story says, than before, so that his crew wept with joy to see themselves whole again. And for a year the ship's company rested on her island, healing from grief and hunger in a comfort they had not known since before Troy. It was Odysseus's own men, in the end, who reminded him what the year had cost. Eurylochus and the others came to him one evening and gently pointed out that he seemed to have forgotten Ithaca entirely, that a year of ease was a year still owed to a wife and a growing son, and that comfort, however sweet, was not the same as home. Odysseus heard them, and though it must have cost him something to leave a place of such rest, he asked Circe to release him. She did not refuse, but she told him plainly that his voyage was not yet finished, and that before he could sail safely on toward Ithaca, he first had to make a stranger and harder journey still, down into the house of the dead, to the edge of the underworld itself, to consult the blind prophet Tiresias, the only shade among the dead still permitted his full understanding about the road that remained ahead of him. Circe gave Odysseus exact directions to a shore at the edge of the world where the sun never properly rises, where the rivers of the underworld meet in a single dark confluence, and told him what rites the dead required before they would speak. His men wept at the order to sail toward death itself rather than home, but they obeyed, and Odysseus dug the trench Circe had described, poured out offerings of milk, honey, wine, and water, and cut the throats of a ram and a black ewe so that their blood filled the pit. At the smell of blood, the shades of the dead came crowding up out of the darkness, old men, young girls, warriors still marked by their wounds. But Odysseus held them back with his sword until the one shade he had come for could drink and speak first. The first to reach him, before even the prophet, was Elpenor, the youngest of his crew, who had died on Circe's island in an accident no one had noticed, falling asleep on her roof, half drunk, and stepping backward off the edge at dawn, his neck broken before his comrades even realized he was missing. His shade begged Odysseus for a proper burial and a marker on the shore, so that his memory would not vanish unmourned. And Odysseus promised to see it done, a small human obligation carried out later exactly as sworn. Then came Tiresias, and what he told Odysseus shaped everything still to come. He confirmed that Poseidon's anger, born of the blinding of his son, would follow the fleet for as long as the god's grudge lived, but that Odysseus could still reach home if he and his men could master one temptation above all others. When they came to the island of the sun god Helios, whatever hunger drove them, they must not touch the sacred cattle that grazed there. For those herds belonged to the god, who saw everything from the sky, and would not let the theft go unpunished. If his men could restrain themselves, Odysseus alone might still reach Ithaca, battered and alone, in a stranger's ship, to find his house full of men consuming his wealth and courting his wife, and would need cunning and violence both to set it right again. If they could not restrain themselves, Tiresias warned, none of them would see home at all. Odysseus also spoke, in that same dim meeting place of the dead, with the shade of his own mother, Anticlea, who had died of grief and longing while he was still at Troy, not knowing whether her son lived or had already been lost. And it was there, hearing from her own voice, what his long absence had already cost his family before the wanderings had even begun, that the weight of the years still owed to Penelope and Telemachus first became fully real to him. Returning to Circe's island as he had promised, Odysseus buried Elpenor with full honors and received from the enchantress a final gift more valuable than any treasure, precise warning of every danger that lay ahead, and how each one might be survived. First, she said, they would pass the island of the Sirens, whose song no mortal had ever heard and lived to tell of, for it promised each listener exactly the knowledge he most wanted, and drew him, helpless with longing, onto the rocks where the bones of earlier sailors lay bleaching in heaps. Circe's remedy was simple and required only obedience. Odysseus was to plug his men's ears with beeswax so that none of them could hear a note. But if he himself wished to hear the siren's song and survive it, he could have his men bind him to the mast tightly and refuse absolutely to release him no matter what he begged or ordered once the singing began. They did exactly this. As the ship drew near the siren's meadow, Odysseus softened the wax with his own hands and pressed it into his crew's ears, then had them lash him to the mast with cords wound tight. When the song began, it was, exactly as promised, unbearable in its sweetness. The sirens called to him by name, praised his glory at Troy, and offered him, if he would only come ashore, knowledge of everything that would ever happen in the world. Odysseus strained against his bonds and begged his men to free him, motioning with his eyebrows, since he could not be heard over the deaf rowing crew, but two of his most loyal men, Perimes and Eurylochus, only bound him tighter exactly as he had ordered them to before the danger began, until the ship had rowed safely out of hearing and the wax could be taken from their ears. It remains one of the story's sharpest images of what faithfulness sometimes requires. Not trusting a man's word in the moment of greatest temptation, but trusting instead the sober instruction he gave before temptation arrived, and holding to it even against his own pleading. No sooner had the danger of the Sirens passed than a worse one appeared. Circe had warned of two paths, and both were fatal. One ran between the wandering rocks, which crushed even the ships of the gods. The other, the one Odysseus chose, ran through a narrow strait guarded on either side by two monsters. On one cliff lived Scylla, a creature with 6 long necks and 6 ravenous heads, housed in a cave too high to reach and too well hidden to attack, who would snatch one sailor from the deck of any ship that passed within reach, always exactly 6, one for each head, no matter how the ship steered to avoid her. On the opposite cliff, close enough that no ship could avoid both dangers at once, The sea itself gathered into the whirlpool Charybdis 3 times a day, sucking down entire ships and the sea around them, and then spewing the water back up in a roar that could be heard for miles. Circe's counsel had been merciless in its clarity. Better to lose 6 men to Scylla than the whole ship and every man aboard to Charybdis. Odysseus, who had promised his men only that danger lay ahead, and had not told them the exact price, steered as close to Scylla's cliff as he dared and watched, unable to stop it, as 6 of his best men were snatched shrieking from the deck and carried, still alive, into her cave to be devoured. The single moment in the whole voyage the poems describe as the most pitiable thing his eyes had yet witnessed. Worse, he says himself, than anything at Troy, because there was nothing at all he could do but watch. Grieving and reduced, yet again, that survivors came at last to Thrinacia, the island of the sun god's sacred cattle, exactly where Tiresias and Circe had both warned that the final test of the voyage would wait. Odysseus, remembering both warnings, wanted to sail past without landing at all, but Eurylochus argued for the crew, exhausted and half-starved, that no man could be asked to spend one more night at the oar without rest. And Odysseus, outnumbered and unwilling to force the issue by violence, agreed to anchor for a single night, only after making every man swear a solemn oath to touch nothing on the island but the food they had brought with them. The oath held for exactly as long as the wind allowed them to leave. But the wind turned against them, and a single night stretched into a full month of contrary gales that pinned the ship on that shore, while the stores they had brought ran out one by one, and the crew was left to survive on whatever fish and birds they could catch. Never enough. Odysseus himself walked inland one day to pray alone for a way out, and the gods, he later realized, chose that exact hour, when he was absent and could not stop it, to let hunger finally break his men's discipline. Led by Eurylochus, who argued that a slow death by starvation was worse than any god's revenge, and that they could always build a shrine to Helios in atonement once they reached home. The crew slaughtered the finest of the sacred cattle and feasted on them, roasting the meat in secret while Odysseus was still away. He returned to the smell of roasting meat and the sound of feasting, and knew before anyone told him exactly what had been done, and exactly what it would cost. The signs came almost at once and were unmistakable. The flayed hides of the cattle began to crawl on the ground as though still alive, and the meat on the spits lowed like living oxen even as it cooked. Helios, discovering the theft of his sacred herd, went to Zeus and demanded justice, threatening that if he were not avenged, he would take his light down into the underworld and shine there instead, leaving the whole world in darkness. Zeus promised to destroy the ship the moment it put back to sea, and 6 days later, when the wind finally turned fair enough to sail, that promise was kept without mercy. A sudden storm split the mast, snapped the ship's timbers apart, and swept every man but Odysseus into the sea. Every single crew member who had eaten the cattle drowned that day, the last of the men who had sailed with him from Troy, gone at once. Exactly as Tiresias had foretold would happen to any man who touched the herd of the sun. Odysseus alone survived, lashed to a broken piece of the ship's keel and mast bound together, and drifted for 9 days and nights on the open sea, carried finally back past the very Strait of Scylla, and Charybdis he had barely escaped before, forced this time to cling to a fig tree growing from the rock above the whirlpool, while his makeshift raft was swallowed and spat out again below him, waiting with terrible patience for the timbers to reappear so he could drop back onto them and continue drifting. On the 10th day, the current and the wind carried him at last to the island of Ægea, alone, without a single ship, a single companion, or a single possession left from the war or from home, exactly as Polyphemus, blinded and furious, had once prayed that he would arrive. Ægea belonged to the nymph Calypso, who found the shipwrecked stranger on her shore, took him in, and, as the story tells it without disguising the matter, fell in love with him and kept him. For 7 years Odysseus lived on her island as her honored companion, offered comforts that few mortal men were ever given, an immortal woman's love, a promise, more than once repeated, that he could become ageless and undying himself if only he would stay and forget the mortal wife waiting for him across the sea. It was, on the surface, the kindest captivity imaginable, and that is exactly what made it dangerous. He was not chained, not starved, not tormented. He was comfortable, wanted and safe, in a place where nothing more would ever be asked of him. And it is worth pausing on this, because it is the clearest proof in the whole voyage that the deepest threat to a faithful heart is rarely violence. It is ease. It is a life offered without struggle, in exchange for forgetting who one is. The story does not pretend that Odysseus was untouched by the offer, or that 7 years passed without any part of him being drawn toward what Calypso promised. But neither does it pretend that he was at peace. Later report of those years describes him spending his days seated on the shore, looking out over the same stretch of water, weeping for the home he could not reach, refusing the immortality that was his simply for the asking, because it would have cost him the one thing an eternal, painless life could not include: Penelope and Ithaca, and the particular, mortal, unrepeatable shape of the life he had already chosen once. Calypso's island offered him everything, except the one thing he actually wanted, and for 7 years that was enough to keep desire itself alive in him, even when hope for its fulfillment had almost none left to stand on. It took the gods themselves to end it. Athena, who had watched over Odysseus since Troy, and had grown impatient at the years wasted on Ogygia, while Penelope's suitors grew bolder, and Telemachus grew old enough to be endangered by them, pressed the case before Zeus while Poseidon was away and could not object. Zeus sent Hermes to Calypso with a plain command: release him. She protested, bitterly and not without justice, pointing out that the gods begrudged goddesses their mortal loves, while indulging their own freely. But she obeyed, because there was no refusing Zeus's word. She helped Odysseus build a raft with her own tools, gave him wine, bread and clothing for the journey, and sent him out at last onto open water, alone toward a home he had not seen in 19 years. Even then the sea was not finished with him. Poseidon, returning from his travels and spotting the raft, raised one final storm out of pure spite, smashing the raft to pieces and leaving Odysseus to swim for 2 days and nights through open water with nothing but a scarf lent to him at the last moment by a sea goddess who took pity on him. Naked, exhausted, and half drowned, he was finally cast up on an unfamiliar shore, where he crawled beneath a heap of leaves between 2 olive bushes for shelter and fell into an utterly spent sleep. A king of Ithaca, husband of Penelope, father of Telemachus, reduced after 10 years of war and 10 more of wandering to a shipwrecked stranger, with nothing to his name but his own life, on the shore of a country he did not yet know, was called Phaeacia. It was a young woman, not a warrior or a king, who found him. Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous and Queen Arete of the Phaeacians, had come to the shore that morning, with her maids to wash the household's linens, sent there in a dream by Athena, who wanted the shipwrecked stranger discovered by someone kind rather than left to die unnoticed on an empty beach. When the washing was finished, the girls had begun a game with a ball, laughing and calling to one another, and it was their voices that woke Odysseus from his exhausted sleep beneath the leaves. He emerged from the thicket naked, salt-crusted, and half-wild with hunger and exposure, holding a leafy branch before him for decency, and every maid but Nausicaa fled shrieking along the shore. She alone stood her ground, and it is one of the story's quiet marvels that a girl young enough to still be unmarried showed more composure in that moment than the seasoned traveler stumbling toward her. Odysseus, drawing on the same careful intelligence that had gotten him past Circe and the Cyclops, did not rush toward her or claim any right to her help. He kept his distance, praised her with courteous, unthreatening words, compared her beauty to a young palm tree he had once seen growing beside a temple, and asked simply for clothing, direction, and the mercy shown to any stranger cast up by the sea. Nausicaa, moved by his dignity in the middle of his wretchedness, gave him clothes from the wash, food and oil to wash the salt from his skin, and, once Athena had quietly made him appear taller and more striking than before, led him partway toward her father's city herself, though she was careful, mindful of gossip, to have him follow at a distance rather than be seen walking beside a strange man through the streets. The palace of Alcinous was, in its way, the last test of Odysseus's patience before he could finally go home, though it demanded a different discipline than any monster had. The discipline of the beggar, the guest without name or claim, who must ask for help by manner and merit rather than by right. Following Nausicaa's advice, he went first to Queen Arete, whose good opinion in that court mattered as much as the king's, and knelt before her hearth as a suppliant, and Alcinous, honoring the sacred custom of hospitality that the Cyclops and the Laestrygonians had trampled, and that Odysseus himself lived by, raised the stranger up, seated him at his own table, and promised to see him home before asking even his name. It was at a feast in his honor, hearing the court's blind bards sing of the fall of Troy, and of the wooden horse whose plan had been his own, that Odysseus finally broke down in tears he could no longer hide, and Alcinous, noticing, gently asked him at last who he was, where he came from, and why the song of Troy struck him so deeply. And so, in the halls of a people he had never met, among strangers who had shown him more honest kindness than nearly anyone since he had left his own shore, Odysseus told the whole story from the beginning: the Cyclones, the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops and the curse of Poseidon, Aeolus and the ruinous bag of winds, the massacre in the Laestrygonian harbour, Circe's island and the year of rest, the descent among the dead and the prophecy of Tiresias, the siren's song, the loss of 6 men to Scylla, the slaughter of the sun god's cattle and the storm that followed, and the 7 long years on Calypso's island that had ended only days before. It is worth noticing what this means for the whole shape of the story. Nearly everything recounted here happened years before Odysseus ever reached this table, remembered and told now in his own voice to a hall of strangers, precisely because the years of wandering mattered less as adventure for its own sake than as the long, hard proof of what it had cost him to keep choosing Ithaca and Penelope over every easier ending the world kept offering instead. Moved by the story and by the man who had lived it, Alcinous and his people gave Odysseus gifts of gold and bronze, beyond even what he had once carried from Troy, loaded a ship with rowers of their own, and set him aboard to sleep the whole crossing through, exhausted past waking, while the swift Phaeacian vessel, famous throughout the old songs for needing no pilot at all, since the ships of that people knew every man's home by instinct, and sailed there unguided, carried him at last, after 10 years of war and 10 years of wandering, back across the sea to the shore of Ithaca, while Odysseus was still fighting his way across the wrecks of 9 islands. A slower and quieter siege was closing around the wife and son he had left behind. No army had crossed the shore of Ithaca, no enemy had battered down the doors. The ruin came instead in a gentler form, wearing fine cloaks and speaking noble names, taking seats by the hearth as if they belonged there. Once it became clear that Odysseus had not returned with the rest of the fleet, and that the years since Troy's fall were stretching into a decade of silence, the sons of the leading families of Ithaca and the nearby islands began to gather in his hall, more than 100 of them in the end, not as guests in need of shelter, but as men who sensed weakness in a kingdom without its king. They ate his cattle, drank his wine, commanded his servants, and lingered day after day beneath his roof, courting his wife on the argument that Odysseus must surely be dead, and that Ithaca could not remain forever without a ruler. This was more than simple greed, though greed was certainly part of it. In the Greek world, the bond between host and guest was sacred, a recognition that civilized life depends on mutual respect for the stranger at one's door. The suitors turned that very code inside out, hiding entitlement inside the language of hospitality, feasting as though the inheritance were already settled and Penelope a prize left waiting for the boldest hand. Penelope could not simply expel them. She had no army of her own, and Telemachus, still a boy when the siege began, had no standing yet to command grown men twice his age. So she resisted with the only tools available to her: patience, timing, and an intelligence sharpened by necessity. Her most famous weapon was a piece of weaving. She announced to the suitors that she would choose a husband among them once she had finished a burial shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's aged father, a task no one could object to, since it was pious, proper, and rooted in a daughter-in-law's duty to the family's dead. By day she wove at the loom in full view of the hall. By night, when the suitors had gone to their beds, she crept back with her maids by torchlight and unpicked what she had made, so that the shroud never grew any closer to completion no matter how many months passed. For 3 years the trick held, and those 3 years bought Telemachus the time to grow from a boy the suitors could dismiss into a young man they could no longer safely ignore. In the 4th year, one of her own maids, bribed or simply careless, betrayed the secret, and the suitors caught her undoing her work by lamplight. The discovery did not diminish what she had done. If anything, it revealed how much cunning and how much quiet exhaustion had gone into holding them off for so long. But it also meant that her oldest and best delay was gone, and the suitors, no longer willing to wait, grew louder, bolder, and more careless of what limits still remained. It was into this hardening danger that Telemachus finally stepped as a man rather than a boy. One morning the goddess Athena came to Ithaca disguised as a family friend, an old visitor named Mentes, and found Telemachus sitting gloomily among the feasting suitors, dreaming of a father he could barely remember and ashamed of his own inability to defend his mother's house. She urged him to do 2 things: call an assembly of the men of Ithaca to publicly name the suitor's crime before the whole community, and then take a ship and go in search of real news of his father, first to Pylos, to see old Nestor, who had commanded ships at Troy and might know what had become of Odysseus, and then on to Sparta, to see Menelaus, husband of Helen, whose own return from Troy had been almost as strange and delayed as anything Odysseus was rumored to have suffered. The assembly, when Telemachus called it, changed little on its own. The suitors simply laughed off his complaints, arguing that the fault lay with Penelope's endless delay rather than with their own greed. But it announced, publicly and for the first time, that the silent, patient boy of the household was prepared to speak. Soon after, guided again by Athena, who this time disguised herself as an old family retainer named Mentor to travel at his side, Telemachus slipped away by ship at night, without even telling his mother for fear the suitors would learn of it and set an ambush, and sailed first to sandy Pylos. Nestor received him with the warm, talkative hospitality of an old man who had outlived most of his companions from Troy, and loved nothing more than to speak of them. He could tell Telemachus a great deal about the war's end, and about the scattered, difficult homecomings of many Greek commanders, some drowned, some murdered by treachery, waiting for them in their own halls, some blown far off course, exactly as Odysseus apparently had been. But of Odysseus himself, Nestor had heard nothing certain, since the 2 of them had parted ways on separate ships soon after Troy fell. He recommended that Telemachus press on to Sparta, since Menelaus, who had wandered as far as Egypt on his own delayed voyage home, might have picked up some more recent word. In Sparta, Telemachus found Menelaus and Helen living together again in evident peace, their household restored, despite everything Helen's abduction had once cost the Greek world. A detail worth noticing in its own right, since it showed Telemachus and shows us that even a marriage broken by war and scandal could still be mended, which quietly strengthened the hope that his own parents' marriage might yet be mended too. Menelaus told him of his own long detour through Egypt, and of pinning down the shape-shifting sea god Proteus on a beach there to force him to reveal news of the other Greek commanders. And among that news, Proteus had told him that Odysseus was alive, though a captive, held on an island by a nymph, weeping for a way home that no ship or crew of his own remained to give him. It was not certain news of a homecoming, but it was the first solid word in years that Odysseus had not died at sea, and Telemachus carried it back toward Ithaca with a mixture of relief and new urgency, since a father merely delayed by grief and a distant shore was a father who might yet return, if only the suitors could be prevented from destroying the household before he did. That urgency was well-founded. Word of Telemachus's voyage had reached the suitors in his absence, and rather than simply waiting for his return, they set an ambush, stationing a ship in the strait between Ithaca and the neighboring island of Same, to kill him on his way home and end, once and for all, the danger that an heir of age might someday reclaim what they had already begun to treat as theirs. Only Athena's guidance, steering his ship along a different course under cover of night, let Telemachus slip past the ambush and land quietly on a far shore of Ithaca. Away from the harbour the suitors were watching, and make his way inland on foot rather than risk the direct route home. It was on that inland path, before he had even reached his mother's hall again, that Telemachus was told to go first to the hut of an old and loyal servant, the swineherd Eumaeus, who had kept faith with the house of Odysseus through every year of the siege, tending the king's pigs on a lonely stretch of the island, while lesser men feasted in the great hall on stock that was rightfully his to guard. It was at that same modest hut, arriving from the opposite direction, and in a very different disguise, that Odysseus himself was about to set foot on his own island for the first time in 20 years. The Phaeacian ship set Odysseus ashore while he still slept, laying him gently on the sand with the gifts of gold and bronze piled beside him, and sailed away before he woke, a homecoming so quiet that he did not at first even recognize his own island, since Athena had wrapped the shore in a concealing mist to keep him hidden until she could prepare him for what waited. When the mist lifted and she appeared before him, disguised at first as a young shepherd, Odysseus, cautious after 20 years of disguises and tricks played on him by gods and monsters alike, did not trust the ground beneath his feet and even tried, out of old habit, to spin the stranger a false story of his own identity rather than reveal the truth. Athena, delighted rather than offended by a caution she herself had helped to teach him, dropped her disguise, laughed at his instinctive deceit, and confirmed that he had indeed reached Ithaca at last. She told him plainly what he would find: a household eaten hollow by more than 100 suitors, a wife besieged but still faithful, and a son grown into a young man now in real danger of being murdered before he could inherit anything at all. Rushing home in triumph would only get him killed. 20 years and one man's strength were no match for a hall full of armed rivals. So Athena disguised him herself, transforming the still vigorous king into the image of an old and wretched beggar, withered skin, thinning hair, ragged clothes, a walking staff, and sent him first, not to the palace, but to the hut of the swineherd Eumaeus, the one servant on the island she knew he could still trust completely. Eumaeus did not recognize his own king in the beggar, who came limping up to his hut, but he did what the suitors in the great hall had long since forgotten how to do. He welcomed a stranger with the full measure of the hospitality due any guest, sharing his own poor meal, giving up his own cloak against the cold, and speaking with real grief of the master he still believed might be alive somewhere, and of the corruption that had taken over his house in his absence. He did not know he was describing all of this directly to the man himself. Odysseus, listening to a servant's unguarded loyalty rather than a courtier's calculated flattery, learned in that hut something no god could have told him as plainly, that faithfulness had survived in Ithaca, in places far humbler than the throne room. Among people the suitors never bothered to notice at all. It was at that same hut, the next day, that Telemachus arrived home from his voyage, and here occurred one of the story's most carefully guarded reunions. Athena restored Odysseus to his true shape for a moment, alone with his son inside the hut, while Eumaeus was sent on an errand, and Telemachus, seeing a stranger suddenly transformed into a man radiant with the bearing of a king, first believed he was looking at a god. Odysseus had to insist, more than once, that he was no god but his own father, before Telemachus would embrace him, and the two wept together over the years the war and the wandering had stolen from them. A father meeting a son who had been an infant in arms when he sailed, now a young man old enough to be marked for murder in his own hall. Together quietly, they began to plan how a household besieged by more than 100 armed men might be reclaimed by 2. Before that plan could unfold, though, the story pauses on a smaller reunion that has outlasted almost every other scene in its power to move an audience. As Odysseus, disguised again as the ragged beggar, finally made his way toward his own palace, he passed an old dog lying neglected on a heap of dung near the gate. Argos, the hound he had raised and trained himself as a puppy 20 years earlier, before he ever sailed for Troy, once the finest hunting dog on the island, now old, flea-ridden and abandoned, since no one in a household run by strangers had any reason to care for an aging animal that served no one's feast. Every other creature and nearly every person Odysseus had met since Troy had needed to be told who he was. Argos alone needed no disguise removed, no test, no proof. The old dog lifted his head, recognized in an instant the smell and shape of the master he had not seen in 2 decades. And though he was too weak now even to rise and approach, he dropped his ears and wagged his tail in greeting. Odysseus saw it and had to turn his face away and wipe a tear so that Eumaeus, walking just ahead of him, would not notice a beggar weeping over an old man's dog and start asking questions no disguise could survive. He could not stop, could not kneel, could not speak a single word of recognition, because the whole plan for reclaiming his house depended on no one, not even a dog, giving him away too soon. And in that same moment, having delivered the one honest, uncalculated welcome home that the whole story allows him, Argos died. It is a small scene, almost a passing detail beside the slaughter and recognition still to come, and yet it carries a particular weight. Of all the household, it was the one without speech, without the capacity for flattery or betrayal, who recognized his king first and loved him last, asking nothing in return but to see him once before the end. Inside his own hall, disguised still as a beggar, Odysseus had to endure what no king should ever have to endure in his own house: mockery from the very men eating his cattle and courting his wife. One suitor, Antinous, threw a footstool at him for daring to ask for scraps. Another, a rival beggar named Iris, who had grown used to working the hall for handouts, tried to drive him off as an unwelcome competitor, and was beaten to the ground, in a scuffle the suitors found richly entertaining, cheering for the ragged stranger without any idea whom they were cheering for. Through all of it, Odysseus held his temper with an iron discipline that had been forged across 10 years of war and 10 more of wandering, watching, memorizing faces, sorting in silence which of his household had remained loyal, and which had gone over to the men now feasting at his expense. It was in this disguise that he finally came face to face with Penelope herself, who had heard that a stranger claiming some knowledge of Odysseus was in the hall and sent for him to be brought before her. She did not know she was speaking to her own husband, and he could not yet tell her, but the conversation between them is one of the most carefully guarded in the whole story, because each is testing the other without either fully admitting it. She asked him, as any prudent woman besieged by false promises for 20 years would, to prove his knowledge with real detail. And he gave it, describing accurately the clothing Odysseus had once worn, and the particular brooch that had pinned his cloak, details a lucky liar might have guessed, but a true witness would simply know. She wept to hear it. Certain now that whatever had become of her husband, this stranger at least, was telling the truth about having met him once, and still she did not know that the truth stood directly in front of her. In that same conversation, Penelope told the stranger of the ordeal the suitors had made of her recent years, the weaving trick that had bought her 3 years before its exposure, and the exhausting balancing act since of appearing neither so firm that the suitors turned violent, nor so soft that they believed her ready to yield. She spoke, too, of a decision she had all but made. Since delay could not continue forever, she intended soon to set a contest for the suitors themselves, one that only her true husband's own strength could win, and let its outcome settle, once and for all, what 20 years of waiting could not. Before that contest could be announced, an old servant nearly ended the disguise before its time. Penelope, moved by the stranger's evident hardship, ordered her aged nurse, Eurycleia, the same woman who had helped raise Odysseus from infancy and had nursed Telemachus in turn, to wash the guest's feet, a customary courtesy to any honored visitor. Odysseus, who had allowed himself to be tested and mocked all evening without flinching, turned away instinctively from the basin, suddenly afraid, because there was one mark on his body that no disguise could hide from someone who had known him as a child. An old scar above his knee, torn open by a wild boar's tusk on a hunting trip in his youth, on the very mountain where his grandfather Autolycus had first given him his name. Eurycleia's hands found the scar the instant they touched his leg, and recognition struck her like a blow. She dropped his foot into the basin, spilling the water across the floor with a clatter loud enough that it very nearly gave everything away, and turned, weeping and trembling, to tell Penelope the truth sitting across the room. But Odysseus, faster even in that instant of exposure than the old woman's shock, seized her by the throat with one hand and pulled her close, warning her in a fierce, low voice that if she spoke one word of what she had found before he was ready, he would kill her himself, despite everything she had done for him as a child. Eurycleia, loyal to the very marrow of that old loyalty, mastered herself, swore silence and said nothing, and across the room, absorbed for once in her own private thoughts, Penelope did not notice what had almost been revealed at her own feet, since Athena, watching over the whole scene, had turned her attention elsewhere at exactly the moment it mattered. It is worth pausing on how much this single scene carries. 20 years of disguise, cunning, and careful timing had brought Odysseus safely past Poseidon's storms, past the Cyclops and the Sirens and the jaws of Scylla, past a goddess's temptation to immortality itself, and very nearly undone, in the space of one instant, by an old woman's hands recognizing a scar from his boyhood. It is a reminder, carried through the whole story, that the truest recognitions rarely come through grand declaration. They come through the body's oldest, smallest evidence, a mark on the skin, the wag of a dying dog's tail, the shape of a bed no stranger could know. Identity in this story is proven not by claim, but by what the years cannot erase. The contest Penelope had spoken of to the disguise beggar was announced the next morning, and it was, on its surface, simple. She would bring out Odysseus's own great bow, a weapon so heavy and so stiff that no man now living in Ithaca had ever managed to string it, along with 12 axe heads set in a row, and she would marry whichever suitor could string the bow and shoot a single arrow clean through all 12 axe sockets, exactly as Odysseus himself had once done for sport. It was, in effect, a contest that only Odysseus could win, dressed up as a fair trial open to every man in the hall. One by one the suitors tried, and failed even to bend the bow enough to string it, straining until their hands blistered, warming the wood over a fire in the hope of softening it, and growing more humiliated with every failed attempt, since a weapon that defeated all of them together made each of them look smaller in front of the others. Antinous, sensing the mood turning ugly, proposed postponing the contest to the next day under cover of a festival, hoping the delay might let tempers cool, and someone eventually managed the string. It was then that the disguised beggar, still sitting quietly among the servants, asked to be allowed to try. The suitors mocked the idea of a ragged stranger succeeding where the finest young men of the islands had failed, and some grew angry at the suggestion, fearing the shame of being shown up by a beggar in front of the woman they were courting. But Telemachus, following the plan he and his father had quietly agreed on, insisted that, as the son of the house, he had the right to decide who could take part, and ordered the bow handed over. Penelope, who had already withdrawn to her chambers as her husband had asked her to, did not witness what followed. Odysseus took the bow that had once been his, turned it over once as a musician might turn an instrument to check its tuning, and strung it in a single smooth motion, without struggle, as easily as he might once have done it 20 years before. The string sang out one clear note as he plucked it to test the tension, and Zeus, unseen, answered with a crack of thunder from a clear sky, a sign Odysseus alone understood, as confirmation that the moment had come. He fitted the arrow, drew and sent it clean through all 12 axe heads in a single shot, and only then, before the hall had even finished gasping at the shock of it, did he turn the bow on the suitors themselves, threw off the last of his rags, and named himself aloud for the first time in 20 years inside his own house. Odysseus, home at last, and owed a reckoning. What followed was swift and merciless. Telemachus, armed and ready, stood at his father's side. The loyal herdsmen Eumaeus and Philoetius barred the hall's other doors, so no suitor could escape to raise the countryside against them. And Odysseus, with the bow and then with spear and sword, once the arrows ran out, cut down the men who had spent 3 years eating his cattle and courting his wife, one after another, refusing every plea for mercy from men who had shown his household none. Only a young herald and a bard who could prove he had sung for the suitors under compulsion rather than loyalty were spared. When the fighting finally thinned and the hall fell silent, the floor was thick with the blood of more than 100 men, and the household that had endured 3 years of siege stood, for the first time since the war began, entirely its own again. It was not a clean or a joyful stillness. The women of the household who had sided with the suitors during the long occupation were identified and punished without softness, and the disloyal Goatherd Melanthius, who had insulted the disguised beggar and armed the suitors against Telemachus during the fighting, met an end as brutal as the crime. Justice in this story arrives as a beginning rather than an ending. Order restored by force in a single violent hour, though trust, dignity, and an ordinary sense of safety in one's own home would take a good deal longer to return. Odysseus had his house back. What he did not yet have, even standing master of his own hall for the first time in 20 years, was his wife. Word of the slaughter reached Penelope's chambers before Odysseus himself did, brought by Eurycleia, radiant with the secret she had kept for a day and a night. The beggar was the master. The master had come. The suitors were dead. Penelope, who had survived 20 years of false rumor and cruel hope, refused to believe it on a servant's word alone, no matter how devoted. She came down to the hall to see for herself, and there she found a man bathed now, dressed in fresh clothes, restored by Athena's art to something like his old bearing, and still she did not run to him. She sat instead across the hearth from him in silence, studying his face, while Telemachus, embarrassed and impatient, accused his own mother of hard-heartedness for not embracing a father he had waited his whole life to know. Only someone who has never lived through years of engineered false hope could mistake her caution for a failure of love. Penelope had spent 2 decades learning exactly how dangerous belief could be. Rumors that came to nothing, strangers who claimed knowledge they did not have, a world that kept pressing her to accept convenient endings. A clever man could learn names, gather details, wear a stranger's confidence, appearances. She knew better than anyone in that hall could be made to lie. So she did what a woman of her intelligence would do. She waited, she watched, and then she tested him. Not out of coldness, but as the last and surest defense of a love she had refused to surrender for 20 years. She turned to the one secret that belonged to no one else in the house. Speaking to a servant, but loud enough to be heard, she ordered the bed moved out of the couple's own chamber and made up for the stranger elsewhere. An instruction that sounded almost ordinary, practical, the kind of thing said to any guest for the night. To Odysseus, it struck like a hand laid on an old wound. He answered at once, with more heat than a stranger's courtesy could explain, demanding to know who had dared move that bed, because that bed could not be moved without destroying it entirely. He himself had built it, years before, around the living trunk of an olive tree still rooted in the earth, shaping the whole bedchamber around that single growing trunk, so that the bed was not a piece of furniture carried in from outside, but something grown into the house at its very foundation. No impostor could have known that. A pretender might learn names, victories, the layout of a palace, stories repeated by others, but the private architecture of a marriage, the exact secret of a bed built with his own hands, before the war ever separated them, belonged to no one but the 2 people who had shared that chamber. When Penelope heard him describe it correctly, in every detail, her legs gave way beneath her and she ran to him at last, weeping, and put her arms around his neck. 20 years of restraint broke in that single moment, and Odysseus, who had endured shipwreck, monsters, a goddess's temptation to immortality, and the slaughter of more than 100 men without visible collapse, held his wife and wept with her as freely as she wept with him. It is worth returning, at the very end of the journey, to what that single test reveals about both of them. Odysseus, master of disguise, the man who had survived 20 years by knowing exact when to conceal himself and when to reveal the truth, understood better than anyone why Penelope could not simply take a stranger's word for who he was. And Penelope, who had been mistaken by nearly everyone in her own hall for a woman merely waiting, showed in that single request that her fidelity had never been passive belief. It had been discernment, held steady across 2 decades, that refused to hand her heart to anything less than certainty. Their reunion, when it finally came, was not the triumph of one partner's patience over the other's absence. It was the meeting of 2 people who had each, in entirely different ways, spent 20 years proving the same thing. That love, tested honestly, does not need to be naive to remain faithful. One reunion still remained. In the morning, Odysseus went out from the palace to the modest orchard where his father Laertes now lived, having withdrawn from the hall years earlier in grief, unable to bear the slow ruin of a house he could not defend, growing old among his own vines and fruit trees with a single servant for company, worn thin by mourning a son he had almost given up as lost. Odysseus found him there in patched clothes, digging around a young tree with his own hands, and could not resist testing him first, as he had tested nearly everyone else on the island, by claiming to be a stranger who had once entertained Odysseus as a guest years before and had heard he might be dead. Laertes' grief at the false report was so immediate and so total, tears falling into the dirt he had been turning, that Odysseus could not bear the disguise a moment longer. He revealed himself, at last, not through claim alone but, as with Penelope, through unmistakable evidence. The old scar above his knee, and a memory from childhood that only a father could confirm. The exact fruit trees Laertes had once given him as a boy, counted out one by one, 13 pear trees, 10 apple trees, 40 fig trees, promised to a small son walking beside him through this same orchard. Laertes, hearing that precise, private accounting recited back to him by a man he had just been told to believe was his own returned son, needed no further proof. Father and son embraced in the orchard where Odysseus had once learned as a boy the patient work of tending what one hopes to harvest only years later. A fitting place, the story suggests, for the last recognition of a homecoming built entirely on patience. The peace that followed was not entirely without cost. The families of the slain suitors, grieving their own dead, gathered in anger and marched on the household to demand vengeance. And for a moment it seemed that the violence in the hall might simply widen into a feud that could consume Ithaca for another generation. It took the direct intervention of the gods to close what human anger alone could not. Athena appeared before both sides, and at her command, and at a final word from Zeus himself, the memory of the slaughter was set aside by decree, and the two sides were reconciled under oath, so that the household which had endured 20 years of one man's absence and 3 years of open siege could finally settle into an ordinary peace rather than an endless cycle of retaliation. Order, which force had restored in a single violent hour, was in this way given a chance to become something steadier, not merely a victory, but a genuine ending, allowed at last to hold. Every culture that has ever told the story of Odysseus and Penelope has also told other stories about love tested by war, death, and time, and it is worth pausing here, before returning to Ithaca one last time, to set their marriage beside a handful of these other famous couples from the same body of Greek myth. Each pairing shows a different shape that devotion can take when circumstance presses hardest against it, and each, by contrast and by comparison, helps to explain exactly what made the love between Odysseus and Penelope so unusual even among legends, built entirely out of extraordinary loves. The story of Odysseus and Penelope has always lived alongside other great love stories from the same world of Greek myth, and it is worth setting it beside a few of them, because each shows a different shape that faithful love can take when it is tested by absence, death, or the simple cruelty of time. And each, by contrast, makes clearer what is unusual about a marriage that survived 20 years, and in the end was allowed to come home. Consider first the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which begins, like so many great love stories, with a wedding. Orpheus was the finest musician the world had ever produced, a singer whose voice and lyre could calm wild beasts, move rivers from their courses, and soften the hearts of stone. He loved his bride Eurydice completely, and on the very day of their marriage, while she walked through the grass with her attendants, a viper struck her heel, and she died before evening fell. Where Penelope's grief was stretched across 20 slow years of uncertainty, Orpheus's grief arrived all at once, total and immediate, with no ambiguity to soften it, and no hope of a message that might one day contradict it. He could not accept the finality of it. Rather than mourn in the ordinary way of mortals, Orpheus did something no one had attempted before him. He went down alive into the underworld itself, using the same voice that could charm wild animals to charm instead the powers of death. He sang before Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead, of his love and his loss, until even those two implacable rulers wept. The poets say it was the only time the dead themselves, worn smooth by an eternity of hearing pleas, were moved to grant one. They agreed to release Eurydice back to the world of the living, on a single absolute condition. Orpheus must walk ahead of her all the way to the surface, without once turning back to look at her, trusting that she followed, until they had both fully returned to the light. It should have been a simple thing to keep his word for so short a distance, but doubt is often more dangerous than any river or gate. As Orpheus climbed the last steps toward daylight, with no proof but his own faith that Eurydice still walked behind him, in the dark, uncertainty overcame him. He turned to look, only a moment too soon, only a single step before the surface. And in that instant she was pulled back down into the shadows forever, her hand reaching toward his as she vanished, the condition broken, the gift withdrawn as swiftly as it had been given. The contrast with Odysseus and Penelope is instructive. Orpheus's love was proven in an act of extraordinary daring, walking alive into the land of the dead, but it was undone by a single failure of trust, a moment when faith could not hold out for just a few more steps. Odysseus and Penelope's love was tested, not in one dramatic instant, but across 20 grinding years, through storms and temptations and false hope, and a bed used as the final proof of identity, and it survived precisely because trust was renewed again and again, rather than staked on a single unbroken moment. Where Orpheus looked back too soon and lost everything, Penelope waited to look at all, refusing even to believe her own eyes and her own longing, until the proof was beyond question. And it was that very refusal to trust too quickly that let her love survive intact into the daylight, rather than be swallowed by it. A second story worth setting beside Penelope's is that of Alcestis and Admetus, a marriage that also tested how far love could be asked to go, though it asked something even more extreme than years of patient waiting. It asked for a life traded directly for another. Admetus, king of Pherae, had once been shown great kindness by the god Apollo, who served him for a time as a shepherd in punishment for a crime of his own, and out of gratitude for how gently Admetus had treated him during that service, Apollo later intervened to spare the king from an early death that fate had marked for him, but only on one condition. Admetus would be allowed to live past his appointed hour, only if someone else could be found willing to die in his place. He asked his own elderly parents first, reasonably assuming that a father or mother, near the natural end of life, might be willing to shorten it for their son's sake. And both refused, unwilling to give up even their last remaining years. It was his young wife, Alcestis, who volunteered instead, choosing to die so that her husband might live, out of a devotion so complete that it startled even the gods who had arranged the bargain in the first place. Alcestis died as promised, and Admetus, who had accepted her sacrifice in a moment of fear, was left afterward to face what he had actually agreed to, a long life purchased at the cost of the one person whose company had made that life worth living. His grief, once she was gone, was bitter and complicated by guilt, in a way that Penelope's grief for an absent husband never had to be, since Penelope never had to weigh her own survival against Odysseus's death, and never had to live with having let someone else pay the price for her, instead of paying it herself. It happened that the hero Heracles arrived at Admetus's house as a guest during the very days of mourning, and Admetus, holding to the same sacred law of hospitality that runs through so much of this world's mythology, the same law that Odysseus depended on among the Phaeacians, and that the suitors trampled in his own hall, concealed his grief rather than turn away a guest, and welcomed Heracles properly despite his sorrow. Moved once he learned the truth of what his host had just endured, and grateful for a hospitality preserved even through fresh grief, Heracles went to the very tomb where Alcestis had just been laid, wrestled death itself in single combat at the graveside, and dragged Alcestis back from the underworld by main force, returning her to her husband very much alive. Set beside Penelope, Alcestis represents faithfulness expressed as total, immediate sacrifice, a single, absolute act, the surrender of one's own life outright, rather than the 20-year discipline of patience, delay, and careful judgment that carried Penelope through her own ordeal. Both women's stories end in reunion, but by very different roads. Alcestis's love is proven by what she was willing to give up all at once. Penelope's love is proven by what she was willing to endure, unglamorously, for 2 decades, without ever once being asked to make so final a choice. Each shows a different face of the same underlying truth. That faithful love, however it is finally tested, is measured not by the size of a single gesture, but by whether it holds when everything depends on it. A third marriage belongs to the very war that separated Odysseus and Penelope in the first place. Seen from the losing side of the walls, Hector, greatest of the Trojan princes, and his wife Andromache, whose story offers perhaps the starkest contrast of all, because it is a love that never got the chance to be tested by years of waiting at all. Only by the certainty of an ending neither of them could prevent. Hector knew, long before the final battle that took his life, that Troy was likely doomed and that he himself would probably die defending it. In one of the most tender scenes in all of the old poetry of that war, he pauses on the city walls before returning to the fighting to see his wife and his infant son, Astyanax, one more time. Andromache begs him not to go back out, reminding him that she has already lost her father and her 7 brothers to war and has no family left in the world besides him, and that if he dies, she and their son will be left with nothing at all. Hector cannot refuse the battle. His honor and his duty to the city bind him as surely as Odysseus's honor once bound him to the summons for Troy. But he holds his son for a moment, laughing when the boy is frightened by the horsehair plume on his father's helmet, and prays aloud that the child might grow up to be an even greater man than himself. It is one of the few completely undivided moments of pure family tenderness in the whole cycle of stories about that war, and it is made almost unbearable by how clearly both husband and wife already sense that it will not last. Hector dies soon after, killed by Achilles outside the very walls his wife had begged him not to leave, and the aftermath for Andromache was far crueler than anything Penelope was ever made to suffer, where Penelope faced 20 years of uncertainty, but was eventually granted a real reunion. Andromache faced no uncertainty at all, only the absolute knowledge that her husband was gone, followed by the fall of her city, the loss of her home, and finally slavery in a foreign land as a captive of the very war that had killed him. Her son Astyanax, the child Hector had held and blessed on the walls, did not survive the sack of Troy either. Thrown from the city's battlements by the conquering Greeks so that Hector's line could not one day return to threaten them. A horror that has no equivalent anywhere in the story of Odysseus and Penelope's own household. Set against Andromache's fate, Penelope's 20 years of waiting, however painful, at least preserved the possibility of an ending. Andromache's love for Hector was every bit as real and as faithful as Penelope's for Odysseus, but circumstance denied her even the uncertain hope that sustained Penelope through her own trial. It is a hard reminder, buried inside the very same war that both stories share, that faithful love does not always earn a reunion simply because it is deeply felt. Sometimes devotion is complete and the ending is still loss. That contrast is part of what makes Penelope and Odysseus's story feel, even to ancient audiences who knew both tales well, like something closer to a gift than a guarantee. Proof that endurance can be rewarded without ever pretending that it always will be. A fourth comparison is worth making, because it shows how a love story can be destroyed by nothing more than a tragic misunderstanding, with no god, no monster, and no war required at all. Pyramus and Thisbe were young neighbors in the city of Babylon, in love since childhood, whose families forbade their marriage out of old rivalry between the two households. Living in adjoining houses separated by a single shared wall, the two lovers discovered a narrow crack in that wall through which they could whisper to each other at night, close enough to hear each other's voices, near enough to feel the shape of the wall between them, and yet permanently unable to touch, unable to bear the separation any longer. They agreed at last to slip away from their homes in secret and meet beneath a mulberry tree outside the city walls, planning to run away together where no family rivalry could reach them. Thisbe arrived first and waited in the moonlight until a lioness, fresh from a kill and still stained with blood, came to drink at a nearby spring. Thisbe fled in terror, dropping her veil as she ran, and the lioness, sniffing at the fallen cloth, mauled it with her bloody jaws before wandering off into the night. When Pyramus arrived and found the torn, blood-stained veil lying on the ground with no sign of Thisbe anywhere, he leapt to the only conclusion the evidence seemed to allow, that his beloved had been killed by the very lioness, whose tracks he could see in the dust around him. Unwilling to live in a world without her, and blaming himself for having asked her to meet him in so dangerous a place at night, he drew his own sword and took his life beneath the mulberry tree, exactly where they had planned to meet. Thisbe, returning cautiously once the lioness was gone, found him dying, and rather than survive him, took up the same blade and followed him into death a moment later. The white berries of the mulberry tree above them, the story says, were stained dark red forever after by their mingled blood, and have grown that color ever since. Set beside Penelope, this is love destroyed not by malice, distance, or even fate in the grand sense, but by a single wrong conclusion drawn too quickly from incomplete evidence, the very mistake Penelope spent 20 years carefully refusing to make, where Thisbe's veil convinced Pyramus of a death that had not actually happened, and cost both of them their lives before the truth could catch up to the assumption. Penelope refused every rumor, every stranger's claim, every seemingly conclusive sign that Odysseus might be dead, or that the man before her might be an impostor, until she had tested the truth herself beyond any reasonable doubt. It is a small, sobering thought to carry out of the mulberry grove and back toward Ithaca, that the discipline Penelope practiced for 2 decades, the refusal to trust appearances too quickly, however convincing they seemed, was not merely admirable patience. In a story like Pyramus and Thisbe's, that same discipline would have been the difference between tragedy and survival. A final comparison is worth making precisely because it does not end in reunion, sacrifice, or even tragedy shared equally between 2 devoted partners. It ends in betrayal, and it serves as a warning about what faithful love is not. Medea, a princess and a powerful sorceress in her own right, fell in love with the hero Jason when he arrived in her homeland seeking the golden fleece, and gave up everything for him. She betrayed her own father to help Jason steal the fleece, guided the Argonauts safely past dangers no stranger could have survived alone, and even, in the most extreme telling of the story, killed and dismembered her own brother to delay her father's pursuing ships, long enough for Jason's crew to escape. There is no question of Medea's devotion in those early years. By any measure of sacrifice, she gave Jason more than almost any other figure in Greek myth gave for love. Jason, however, did not match that devotion with anything like Penelope's 20 years of tested loyalty, or Odysseus's refusal of Calypso's immortality. Once safely home with the fleece and his reputation secured, he set Medea aside in favor of a politically advantageous marriage to a princess named Glauce, whose father could offer him a throne, abandoning the wife who had given up her family, her homeland, and her own hand's innocence for his sake, treating 20 years' worth of sacrifice as though it were merely a useful stage in his own advancement, rather than a bond owed anything in return. Medea's response, unlike anything in Penelope's story, was not patient endurance but a devastating and terrible revenge. She sent Jason's new bride a poisoned robe that burned her alive the moment she put it on, and then, in the myth's darkest turn, killed her own 2 children by Jason, rather than leave them to be raised by the man who had betrayed her, or surrendered to enemies who might use them against her. She escaped afterward in a chariot drawn by dragons, leaving Jason alive but utterly ruined, stripped of family, reputation, and the very throne his betrayal had been meant to secure. Set against Penelope, Medea shows what happens when devotion this total is met, not with equal faithfulness, but with abandonment, and how catastrophically love can curdle into vengeance when one partner's sacrifice is simply spent rather than honored. Penelope's story works, in the end, precisely because both halves of the marriage kept faith. Her 20 years of patient waiting were matched by Odysseus's own, 20 years of refusing every easier comfort the world offered him, from Circe's island to Calypso's promise of immortality. Medea gave everything and received betrayal in return. Penelope gave everything and it was, eventually, returned to her in kind. The difference between the 2 stories is not the depth of the women's devotion, which was immense in both cases, but whether the person on the other end of that devotion proved worthy of it. One last comparison is worth adding, if only because it offers something almost none of the others do. A love story that begins in disaster and ends, cleanly and completely, in rescue. Andromeda was the daughter of a vain queen, Cassiopeia, who had boasted that her own beauty surpassed that of the sea nymphs, an insult the sea god Poseidon would not let stand. In punishment, he sent a monstrous sea creature to ravage the coastline of her husband's kingdom, and an oracle declared that the only way to appease the god and end the destruction was to chain the queen's own daughter, Andromeda, to a rock by the shore as an offering to the beast, an innocent made to pay for a mother's pride. Perseus, returning by air from his own quest to kill the Gorgon Medusa, happened to fly over that coastline and saw Andromeda chained to the rock below, weeping, waiting for a monster she had no way to fight and no part in deserving. He fell in love with her at once on sight, before a single word had passed between them, and made a bargain with her father on the spot. He would kill the sea monster and free her if he could have her hand in marriage as his reward. Using the severed head of Medusa, whose gaze turned any living creature to stone, Perseus turned the sea monster itself into rock the moment it rose from the water to devour her, and Andromeda was freed in the very instant her death had seemed most certain. Set beside Penelope's story, Perseus and Andromeda offer something almost entirely opposite in shape. A love proven in a single dramatic act of rescue rather than 20 years of patient endurance, decided in one afternoon rather than 2 decades. There was no long separation to survive, no false report to doubt, no imposter to test, only a sudden danger and a sudden salvation. And yet it belongs in the same gallery of stories, because it reminds us that faithful love in Greek myth does not always take the shape of waiting. Sometimes it takes the shape of arriving in time, where Penelope's triumph was to hold the line for 20 years until her husband could finally return to her. Andromeda's was simply to survive, chained and helpless, until the one person capable of saving her happened to look down at exactly the right moment. Both stories, different as they are, insist on the same underlying truth, that love proves itself not by how it is declared, but by what it is willing to do and to endure when it is tested. 2 smaller stories round out this gallery of comparison, each showing a different, quieter face of devotion than either Orpheus's daring or Alcestis's sacrifice. The first belongs to an elderly couple named Baucis and Philemon, who lived in modest poverty in the hill country of Phrygia and had grown old together in a small cottage. content with very little, after a marriage that had lasted their entire adult lives. When the gods Zeus and Hermes once traveled through that country, disguised as ordinary weary travelers, testing the hospitality of the region, every wealthier household turned them away at the door. Only Baucis and Philemon welcomed the two strangers in, offering what little food and wine they had with a warmth that came from genuine kindness rather than any hope of reward, embarrassed only that they had so little worth offering to guests. When their wine jug, to their astonishment, never ran dry no matter how many times it was poured, they realized they were entertaining gods rather than travelers, and in fear tried to catch and kill their one remaining goose as a proper sacrifice, only for the gods to stop them, revealing themselves and, in gratitude for a hospitality the wealthy had refused to show, spared the old couple from the flood that was about to drown the whole ungrateful region around them, transforming their humble cottage instead into a temple, with the two of them made its priest and priestess. When the gods later asked what single gift the couple wished for in return, Baucis and Philemon did not ask for youth, or wealth, or any of the things most mortals might have wanted. They asked only that neither of them should ever have to bury the other, and that they might die together, at the very same hour, having spent their whole lives as devoted companions. The gods granted it. When their end finally came, many years later, each of them began to turn into a tree at the same moment, standing side by side at the door of their temple ever after, an oak and a linden grown from the same root, their branches intertwined above the place where they had once shared a simple meal with strangers who turned out to be gods. Set beside Penelope, their devotion shows faithfulness not tested by distance or war, but simply sustained quietly and without any grand trial at all, across an entire ordinary lifetime, proof that the same steady loyalty that carried Penelope through 20 extraordinary years can also be the very substance of a whole unremarkable life, lived well from beginning to end. The second belongs to Ceyx and Alcyone, a king and queen whose story returns, fittingly, to the same sea that separated Odysseus from his own wife. Ceyx set out on a voyage by ship against Alcyone's fearful pleading, and was drowned in a storm at sea exactly as she had dreaded he might be. Grieving and unaware for a time of what had happened, Alcyone prayed daily to the gods for her husband's safe return, until the goddess Hera, moved to pity by prayers that could never be answered, sent a messenger through the god of sleep to show Alcyone the truth in a dream, an image of Ceyx's own drowned form appearing to her exactly as he had died, so that she would finally know rather than wait in false hope forever. When Alcyone woke and ran to the shore in her grief, she found her husband's body washed up on the rocks, and in her despair she threw herself into the waves after him rather than live on alone. The gods, moved by a devotion that could not survive separation even in death, transformed them both into halcyon birds, the same birds later said to nest on the calm surface of the winter sea during the brief period, each year still called halcyon days, when the waters remain quiet enough for them to raise their young undisturbed. Where Penelope's story finds its wonder in a wife who refused to give up hope for 20 long years even without proof, Alcyone's story finds its own kind of tragedy in a wife who could not go on once hope was finally, mercifully replaced by certainty. Both truths sit side by side in the old myths without contradiction. Sometimes love survives best by continuing to hope against the odds, and sometimes hope, once broken, cannot be carried a single day further. Penelope's particular triumph was that her 20 years of disciplined, clear-eyed waiting were never actually broken by the certainty Alcyone received. She was spared, in the end, from ever having to learn whether her own faith could have survived proof of the worst. Looking back across the whole of it, the quiet island, the marriage barely begun before war interrupted it, the 10 years at Troy, the 10 years of monsters and storms and a goddess's offer of eternal comfort, the 3 years of a wife's patient deception, the final test of a bed no impostor could invent. It is worth asking why this particular story has outlived nearly every other tale told about that same war. It is not only because it is filled with the dazzling things myth so often offers. Wars fought beneath famous walls, gods interfering in mortal lives, monsters waiting in the dark, shipwrecks, prophecies, disguises, revenge, and a kingdom regained. All of that gives the tale its grandeur, its motion, its danger, its wonder. But grandeur alone rarely explains why a story continues to live in the hearts of those who hear it centuries later. It endures because underneath all of that spectacle sits something almost unbearably ordinary. Two people trying to stay true to each other across a distance. Neither of them chose, and neither of them could fully control. Odysseus does not remain faithful to home, merely because the memory of it is pleasant. He remains faithful because he keeps turning back toward it inwardly, even while an island of ease or a goddess's love keeps offering him reasons to stop. Penelope does not remain loyal because waiting is simple or passive. She remains loyal because she performs that same inward return every day for 20 years, refusing to let uncertainty rewrite the meaning of a bond she entered with trust. Neither of them is protected from doubt, temptation, exhaustion, or fear. Their faithfulness is not the absence of those pressures. It is the repeated, unglamorous victory of memory and choice over everything that might have worn it down. That is why the story still matters to people who will never sail a stormy sea or face a cyclops in a cave, or sit at a loom unweaving by torchlight. Most love is never tested in the language of epic, and yet many ordinary hearts recognize this same challenge in quieter form. Staying true across distance, silence, delay, and the countless small temptations of an easier path, when nothing forces you to keep choosing the same person, except the fact that you keep choosing them. Odysseus and Penelope endure, in memory and in myth, because they continued to grant reality to what could not currently be touched, trusting a bond that had to be renewed inwardly again and again before it could ever be renewed in the flesh. 20 years divided them. Neither year erased what they had built before the ships ever left the harbor. And that, more than any monster or any god, is the true heart of the greatest love story the ancient world ever told.